Remember walking through British home stores? That feeling of walking in on a Saturday afternoon, picking up towels, browsing cardigans, grabbing a coffee at the in-store cafe. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't cutting edge, but it felt familiar. For generations, BHS was part of British life, a place where value met tradition, a department store for the everyday shopper. But then almost overnight, it vanished. A once thriving business gone. Thousands of workers out of a job, and a pension fund missing hundreds of millions of pounds. So how does a company worth over $1 billion end up sold for just $1? Was it bad business, corporate greed, or something far worse? This is the jaw-dropping rise and fall of British home stores, and why its collapse became one of the biggest retail scandals in UK history. Let's rewind to 1928, South London, Brixton. The first British home stores opened its doors with a bold promise. No item would cost more than a shilling. That's about 5p in today's money. In the aftermath of World War I, money was tight. Families struggled. BHS offered something new. A place where ordinary people could afford the essentials. Cheap clothes, practical homeware, basic lighting and furnishings. BHS wasn't flashy, but it was needed. The store tapped into the growing middle class who didn't want luxury, they wanted value. And BHS delivered. Throughout the 30s and 40s, more stores opened. Even during World War II, when resources were scarce, BHS kept trading. It became a quiet symbol of post-war resilience. By the 1950s, BHS had become a household name. Britain was rebuilding. Living standards were rising, and so was demand for affordable, decent quality retail. BHS responded by expanding. Bigger stores, broader ranges. From curtains and cutlery to school uniforms and suits, if you needed it, chances are BHS had it. It wasn't just a shop, it became a family routine. Mum browsing linens, Dad picking up light bulbs, kids dragging you to the cafe for a sausage roll or an iced bun. By the 1980s, BHS had over 160 stores nationwide. Their formula was simple: be everything for everyone, and do it cheaply. But even golden ages don't last forever. The 1990s brought change, big change. The UK high street was becoming crowded, competitive, cutthroat. Fashion trends were moving faster. Fast fashion brands like Zara and H&M arrived with trendier designs at lightning speed. At the same time, IKEA revolutionized homeware with style and scale. Even supermarkets were changing, no longer just food, but clothes, electronics, home goods. Tesco, Asda and Sainsbury's suddenly looked a lot like BHS, but with lower prices. BHS began to lose its identity. Was it a fashion brand, a home store, a family department store? It was trying to be all things, and ending up as nothing in particular. Stores felt dated. Branding looked tired. The customer base aged and younger generations looked elsewhere. But behind the scenes, the bigger storm was still forming. In 2000, everything changed. Enter Sir Philip Green, the retail tycoon, brash, outspoken, known for rescuing brands and milking profits. Green swooped in and bought BHS for $200 million. To many, it felt like a lifeline. Maybe this was the revival BHS needed. And at first, Green talked a good game. He promised to modernize the stores, revamp the fashion, make BHS cool again. He made noise about turning it into the next big retail turnaround. But here's the catch. Instead of investing in innovation, Green and his family extracted hundreds of millions from BHS. In fact, they took out over $400 million in dividends, despite the company being in debt. The business was still making money, but it was being bled dry. From the outside, BHS carried on. The red signs were still on the high street. People still shopped there, but the cracks were growing wider. Stores were becoming rundown. Stock felt outdated. Online presence? Almost non-existent in a world that was rapidly moving digital. BHS tried to branch out. They added food sections, dabbled in online retail, opened massive stores that looked more modern. But none of it stuck. Meanwhile, competitors were racing ahead. Primark became a fast fashion titan. John Lewis grabbed the homeware market. Next modernized its retail presence. BHS just stood still. And then came the twist no one saw coming. In 2015, Philip Green sold BHS for $1. Yes, $1, the price of a chocolate bar. The buyer? Dominic Chappelle, a former racing driver turned businessman with a string of failed ventures and no experience in retail. It was like handing over a sinking ship to someone who didn't know how to swim. The government would later describe the deal as a disaster waiting to happen. And it was. Within just 13 months, BHS collapsed. But the collapse wasn't just financial, it was personal. Because BHS didn't just lose money, it left 22,000 pensioners fearing for their futures. The company's pension fund was in a $571 million black hole. People who worked for BHS for decades, some for their entire careers, suddenly didn't know if they'd be able to retire. Outrage followed, public protests. Parliamentary investigations, newspapers calling for Green to lose his knighthood. He was grilled by MPs, criticized in headlines, and labeled a billionaire who let others pick up the bill. Eventually, after months of pressure, Green agreed to pay $363 million into the pension fund. But many still felt justice hadn't truly been served. In August 2016, the final BHS stores closed, 164 locations gone. 11,000 employees jobless, and hundreds of town centers left with darkened, empty storefronts. It wasn't just the end of a business, it was the end of an era. For many, it felt like watching a piece of British culture vanish, not because it wasn't loved, but because it was mismanaged into oblivion. Today, BHS lives on only in memory and controversy. The brand was briefly resurrected online as BHS.com, but it never recaptured the magic. It folded within a year. And yet, ask anyone who grew up in Britain before 2016 and they'll have a story. That time, they bought a $10 school coat, the family shopping trips, the pick and mix, the weird furniture displays, the dependable feeling of, let's just pop into BHS, they'll have something. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't trendy, but it was reliable. And in the end, that's what made the loss so personal. The fall of BHS is more than just a cautionary business tale. It's about corporate greed over community, short-term profit over long-term stability, people forgotten in the chase for pounds. It became a symbol of a changing Britain, where familiar names disappeared overnight, and the high street became just another battleground for billionaires. BHS didn't collapse because it stopped mattering. It collapsed because the people at the top stopped caring, and that perhaps is the greatest tragedy of all.